Great. I request all the speakers to come back on and unmute yourselves. Unless you have a dog or kid in the background, in which case mute unless you have to speak, I guess. Thank you all for a very interesting session. I think we had almost 300 participants at one point, and we have a lot of questions flooding in. Let me kickstart the discussion by something that is a pretty common theme for a lot of the speakers. So a lot of people use cheap, the plant tower sensors, the purple layers, So, okay, first question would be, how do you calibrate the sensors in your, that you presented the results for, or did you just present the results as they are? And then I'll have a follow-up to that. So Dustin, how about you go first? Or you talked about CO2, sorry, did you actually check the calibration?
I didn't present any data that I collected. All the data presented was other people's work.
Well, that's a nice escape. Andy?
So we were using all of our sensors right out of the box. So kind of replicating, like if a consumer were to purchase one of these, put this in their building. So we didn't do any sort of pre-calibration of the sensors.
Okay, Jeff?
Yeah, so in general, we do a lot of calibration of sensors, but the details of it really depend on the project. So in this case, the aerosol over the course of a year in any of these homes varied a lot. And so we did do some calibrations, but it was at the time we did the calibration, not general for all time.
Right. Yeah, I think Dustin at one point mentioned that you had shown quite a significant effect of indoor sources on PM sensor responses. So I'll come back to you on that, Jeff. But Suresh, any thoughts on sensor calibration?
Yeah, so we've done previously sensor calibrations using sodium chloride, ammonium sulfate, and dust. The bottom line is, these most of these low-cost sensor units are deflameters, and so they're so they are scattering particles, not necessarily from one, but a collection of particles, and they depend on shape and composition of these particles. So I think it's this calibration even between sodium chloride and ammonium sulfate, the response is very different. So I think that the best comparison of these sensors with each other would be when the composition is largely unchanged. Otherwise, yeah. So we did use calibration in our work, at least with these classroom and exchange rate studies. They were all with the same type of particles.
Right. Lisa, any thoughts?
It's really challenging. I had tried to calibrate the two sensors that we had, and unfortunately with these low-cost sensors, as you work with them, you find out their limitations a little bit more. So one of the sensors that we initially, worked with, we didn't realize this, but it requires heavy user interaction. And by user interaction, they require you to open up their app every day and to really open up the sensor every day. If you don't do that, the sensor doesn't store data. And so we had left these sensors at a CDPHE location for about 2 weeks, and we came back with no data on them. We can't just stand there and press the sensor all day. And so sometimes it can be really, really challenging, but I know there's a lot of good work from like Lawrence National Berkeley Labs that has a lot of calibrations that's already done. So yeah, that's a really good question and a tough one.
Yeah, I just jump in here. I didn't present anything that we're doing, but the ASTM method, that was one of our big troubles with how do you go about coming up with a standard method for particles that have varying size distributions indoors and various optical properties indoors. And so, most of these things are done using sodium chloride particle distributions, and we want the 1 to 2 nanometer or micron size. We spent a lot of time discussing this, and there's really no good surrogate for indoor particles because indoor particles are so diverse. And so in the proposed method, what we're proposing is that you have to test the standard both with sodium chloride and a polylatex sphere that's also about the 1 to 2 micron size range. So it's not perfect. It's not going to give you the morphology differences, but it will give you some differences in optical properties. So you'd be able to, if being tested with the ASTM method, you could cover both you know, an organic and inorganic particle at least, even though we're not going to be dealing with the size ranges.
Right. Excellent. Actually, I mean, I had lots more questions from that for both Lisa and Jeff in particular. But Dustin, to follow up on your ASTM, this is a question I had from your talk. Or, I mean, you didn't present on the ASTM, obviously, as you said, but there is work at the US EPA evaluating these sensors. There is the European, I think, Working Group 42 that is looking at some standardization. Do you think, I mean, how synchronized are these efforts?
Not, I mean, with the EPA, we're interacting with them a little bit, but not with the European organizations. You know, the effort through ASTM is originated with South Coast Air Quality Management District in California, and they did all the work that's supporting the standard. And there are actually 3 different standards within ASTM. One for outdoor, which is a practice, which is a little bit more fuzzy. You don't have to do exactly. And the ASTM standards are more, we kind of see them as hopefully more of a gold standard that, you know, if you reach this level, then you're doing a good test, because standards are recipes. You have to follow A, B, C, D. You can't fudge anything, and everybody will get the same result, hopefully.
Unless you're Volkswagen, I guess, but you know. Sorry, not to single out, my first car was a Volkswagen, but anyways, that was a pretty bad episode. So focusing on our indoor air quality, I think this is, this actually came up, and probably Lisa and Jeff and then Andy can comment. So what are the different sources of indoor air pollution in your work? And I think there was a question about some really high PM levels indoors from natural gas heating. Could you explain more about that? Lisa, go ahead.
Sure. I saw the question on particulate matter, PM 2.5 particularly, and there seems to be a very high level in the natural gas heating. And I'm not suggesting that the only source of PM in your home comes from natural gas. That is not my suggestion. We know that PM comes from different sources. Outdoor air is a big driver of indoor air pollutant. So to try and factor that into account for this study, we try to recruit people within the same distance, at least the same proximity. I know that lots of my participants were neighbors. I could practically just walk to their door and then, you know, censor their air going to the other person. And that was I also know the factor that could play into this is wildfire smokes. Again, I can't suggest that PM doesn't come from these sources. They do. PM comes from lots of sources. Sources such as combustion and outdoor air and human activity. We generate a lot of particulate matter on a day-to-day level. What I am suggesting is that where we are in Colorado, Boulder, it is really, really cold. We know a source of particulate matter is combustion. It's a combustion byproduct. And I know for a fact that many of my participants who had furnaces were running them at least all the time, from when they woke up to when they went to bed, because it was so cold in the home that they always wanted it on. So I'm suggesting that the higher levels seen could be from furnaces, but then again, we would like to run a bigger study to find that out. As a hypothesis.
Can I add something to that that we saw in our study that I haven't seen done in the literature, but I think is a really important source of particularly ultrafine particles, is you get a layer of semi-volatile organic stuff over every indoor surface, including the heat exchanger and other parts of the furnace. And so we saw particularly our measurements in the fall when people were turning on their furnace for the first time, we would see just absolutely massive amounts of particularly ultrafine PM, not with the monitor I showed, with other monitors, really, really big. And in some homes, that layer appeared to replenish itself relatively quickly. And so I don't know if this is an important source or not, but I think that that's a potential source that hasn't really been explored.
Right, great. So Andy, any thoughts?
So we were testing ours more sort of controlled, so we could actually know what our sources were. But we were picking some to try and represent a variety of different sources that we may see indoors. So we had a modified propane torch that basically made it less efficient combustion, so it produced more soot. We we burn some incense as sort of like a, aesthetic combustion type source. We of course tested ammonium sulfate particles because that's sort of one of the two standards that people use, along with sodium chloride.
Right. So Andy, I guess one question, sorry to interrupt, but so I guess the question is, so in your study, it seemed that these different particles would have different responses in the sensors. So it looks like both you and Jeff have done some work on this. So could you talk more about that? And that are some of the variability in your results explained by either particle size or particle optical properties, or something else that's causing these sensors to respond differently? And how would you advise any people who are using these sensors to interpret the results?
So based on some of the work I didn't squeeze into the talk today, was actually a paper that was just accepted for publication yesterday. So sort of hot off the press, but not yet, because I still have to do all the paperwork. But the sort of story from that is that it seems like size is a more important factor than the composition, just because it's like how the particles are interacting with light seem to be more driven by the size than what their actual composition is. Of course, the composition isn't totally irrelevant, but it seems like it's a more secondary effect. So like if we're looking at really big particles or really small particles, so like, some of the dust or room sprays, or maybe even some respiratory droplets, the sensors may not work as well because they're too big. And our hypothesis is that there's a lot of turns inside these sensors, so they can't make their way to the laser essentially. And then the issue on the other end of the spectrum with the smaller particles is that they're too small, so that they relative to the wavelength of light of the sensor. So in a sense, the lasers is effectively blind. And I think, if we're talking about, natural gas combustion, I think a lot of those are smaller particles. So we might be missing a whole ton of, like a pilot light on somebody's stove or from somebody's furnace potentially, if we're relying on that as our measurement.
Yeah. Jeff, do you have any thoughts on?
I mean, that was a much more sophisticated answer than I would give. But I would say also, I mean, fundamentally, these are low-cost sensors. I would strongly recommend people use them in a relative manner. And if you're going to use them in an absolute manner, then you've got a lot of calibration, and you have to understand your aerosol and your sensor response to that aerosol.
A lot of nodding heads here. On that note, a pretty common question that came up, a lot of people had this question, what about the number concentrations from these sensors? Are these sensors nephelometers, which basically look at scattering of light by all the particles that go through the sensor? Or are they particle counters? They're counting individual particles and counting their size. I know that Suresh has done some work on this. Andy may have some thoughts, and Dustin as well, but, feel free. Suresh first.
Yeah, I think firstly, these sensors are largely black boxes. They just give us a number. There's some internal logic to it. And so a lot of what we know about the sensors has been from testing and back calculating. So I think most of these studies, the experimental measurements suggest that these are not single particle light scattering instruments, meaning they're not figuring out the size and the number by counting these particles one at a time. And what that means is, it's most likely they're nephelometers. They're looking at a collection of particles, and the scattered signal is proportional to diameter squared or diameter cubed or somewhere in between. So it's much more maybe mass related, but there are some algorithms inside that allow them to give us numbers and sizes. But just a quick note that many of these sensors will give you size distributions and so on, and a lot of that has to be taken with a grain of salt. In all of our measurements, we've seen that these are just some scaling factors that allow them to distribute them into different channels. So I think there is this debate between are they giving us something closer to mass, or are they giving us something closer to number? Frankly, they're giving us something closer. It's somewhere in between. It's It's the power. It's however the optical response of these cells, and so it's not diameter to the power 1 or 3. It's somewhere in between. But again, I think maybe going back to Jeff's point, as long as you're doing relative comparison, you can extract some reasonably useful information. So not to be dismissed in spite of all these problems. I think there's value if you're using them correctly as relative measurements, not absolute.
Jeff, any thoughts?
I don't think I have anything to add to the conversation. No.
All right.
I can build off that a little bit.
Yes.
So I think, so I know Suresh's group has worked on sort of characterizing how they respond to size, and I think it's John Volkin's group at Colorado State actually did some experiments to try and quantify what the underlying size distributions are from the plant tower sensors. And it's this very nice, repeatable, downward step function that it seems like they're assuming some underlying size distribution, and they're using that to, some sort of black magic allows it to spit out PM1, PM2.5, and PM10. I would say that maybe the total PM mass might be reliable, but I'd say that if we want to use PM2.5 from any of these, I don't know if we should trust that, because again, it's sort of assuming it's assuming there's some underlying size distribution to the particles, and so I think it's just adding another layer of uncertainty on top of something that may be uncertain to begin with.
Yeah, so actually, let me follow up on that, Andy. I think the one recommendation has been that if we are using it indoors, at least as long as it's precise and repeatable and you're looking at relative metrics, it is okay. But some of your research has shown that it depends on what is the source indoors, right? The results that you presented today, whether it was toast or incense or something else, that could vary the results significantly and change the slope as much as by 50%, I think. Mm-hmm. So how would you recommend people actually use it as a relative measure rather than as a precise metric?
That is a very good question. I don't know that I have a great answer. I mean, I think the thing to keep in mind is that these are sort of tools that we can use to get a general sense of how things are indoors, right? None of these low-cost sensors are sort of a gold standard. I think if anybody invents a gold standard low-cost sensor, they're going to become a billionaire, because one of these would be in everybody's home, every building we have. So I think it's just, we need to be careful in terms of understanding what the limitations are, which I think is a theme that came up in some of the talks. But I think, and this is maybe a segue into sort of a different topic, we need to be aware that sort of the QAQC on all these sensors is not the same. And so I was trying to highlight that a little bit in my presentation, that, we had 3 of a given sort of model of sensor, and one of those seemed to be very different from the other 2. And so in some other work, so I think again that paper out of John Volkin's group, they showed maybe 25% of their sensors started to drift after time. And I think the same thing has been shown in field work, that some of the sensors drift, some of the sensors don't. And of course there is that the paper from Andre Farrer's group that there's maybe 50% variance among 66 different sensors of the same unit. So I think that's a bigger concern that I have than anything else. How reliable are these things, and can we trust a single one in a single building if we have nothing to compare it to, right? If I have a sensor in my office here and it says it's 5 micrograms per meter cubed, that's good. But if my sensor is biased low, then I'm misrepresenting my actual exposure.
Yeah.
So I'll get off my soapbox now and let somebody else talk.
So can I jump in on that?
Yes, Dustin.
So I think the power of these sensors is not the absolute value. I think the power is educating the occupant. So, you know, if Jeff turns on his diffuser like he does every night, he can see that the concentration is increasing significantly, and he's going to make the mental note eventually that maybe I shouldn't use that diffuser. Likewise, you know, if you're in a classroom and you notice that you open the window and the CO2 concentration crashes, it starts to make it so that the user can actually take actions. And if we're targeting, if that's our question of what these things can do, they do it very well, depending on if it's PM or CO2. Every study you see that when an event occurs, there is a spike in the sensor. Whether or not it's a relevant, it's a health metric or some other concentration we can trust, that's the discussion you guys have just had. But the discussion is, you know, if you're trying to use these sensors to improve indoor air quality by letting people take actions, and for instance, if they're in a classroom, they see a huge spike in CO2, then they know they need to go to the building operators and say, hey, we need to adjust this classroom. We need to work on this classroom. To me, that's the power of these sensors. It's not that my sensor is saying that, you know, the PM 2.5 concentration is 29.6, so therefore I need to kick on the HVAC system, because that starts getting into a mess. But I think these sensors have a really powerful role to educate people about indoor air quality, not necessarily total indoor air quality, but how their actions can impact it.
Great. Thanks, Dustin. Actually, so I think we had enough discussion about sensor performance and individual, what do they mean? Moving on to more practical terms or more useful terms. Dustin, there was a question for you about wood smoke PM and COVID, and how do you actually, is it a better solution to just close all outdoor air coming in? What do you have to say for that?
No. So yeah, I mean, those are two separate problems. COVID is an indoor source. So we definitely want to ventilate because we're humans, we're indoors, we're crowded. That's where the source is. So COVID, we definitely want to be having an outdoor air. Wildfire, obviously we have an outdoor smoke. And so, you know, in an instance of a wildfire and you're under a plume, yes, you probably do want to turn off your outdoor source for that short duration of period of time if you can, but you don't want to do it too long, because remember, most of our sources indoors, our concentrations of chemicals indoors are higher than the concentration outdoors because our sources are indoors. And so that outdoor dilution is highly important. So there are cases where, yes, you definitely want to be treating the air with as best filtration as you can. If you're next to a roadway or something like that, but not for prolonged periods of time. You want to use your outdoor air as much as you can.
Right, great, thanks. So Suresh, you had some interesting results on the ACH relative to for particles versus CO2, and that you need really high ACH values of 10, whereas we normally see values of 6 being recommended. Could you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think, again, I think the point I was trying to make is that, you know, a lot of these standards, ASHRAE standards, have been based on CO2 emissions. So more people, we've got to just have, you know, that's when you've got to bring more and more and more airflow in. And so typically indoors, you know, it's 1 to 5. It's fantastic. Most homes would have less than 1. Because you're trying to minimize bringing, if you bring outdoor air in, you need to warm it or cool it and so on. It's very energy intensive. And so we tend to have, you know, tight buildings with low air exchange rates. And so historically, classrooms and so on, you know, 5 to 10 has been quite a bit. And I think even right now, WHO is recommending what, 10 liters per second, which in a big lecture hall, I calculated based on our lecture hall here that hosts 100 students, that would amount to an air change rate of 5. Which, if you do that, your CO2 concentrations will be acceptable. And if you scale it by the number of people in the room, you'll always have an acceptable CO2. But if you're talking in the COVID times right now, there could just be one emitter. And if you are meeting with that one emitter one-on-one, you still want to minimize the probability of transmission. Right now, all of our classes are on 25% occupancy. So theoretically, you can be satisfying ASHRAE guidelines by cutting ventilation from what it was before to down by factor 4. Theoretically, of course, nobody's doing that. But what we really need right now is sort of with bioaerosol, you need the max ventilation independent of how many people there are. So it goes against everything we've been trying to do to be energy intensive, to be energy efficient. I mean, so we need to bring energy efficiency at some point, but right now, if you can't detect whether we have SARS-CoV-2 or not, the thing we got to do is max out our ventilation, because what that does is it will dilute any emission that I put out, minimizes the concentrations, number one. Number two, it actually allows for social distancing when you talk about sub 5 micron particles, which is what I'm putting out quite a bit as I am talking right now. And so that is not possible under the classical, ACH of 5 or 6. So, okay. So I think this is going to probably get revisited by ASHRAE over time. But under the pandemic, we really need to be. It's about air exchange rates. But I one final note on this: the equivalent air exchange rate could potentially be achieved without bringing fresh air for biological stuff. So the air exchange rate of 5 or something is good for bringing CO2 down. The rest that would be good to bring particle concentrations down could be just recycled air, where the air is recycled through filters. So that might bring CO2 back, but that's okay. But the recycling is good enough to achieve this higher air exchange rates. So that's probably a way to get energy efficiency still.
Okay, so this is a good segue to the question I wanted to ask Jeff. Is we talked about air filtration and we talked about ventilation, and in your results, because of the older home that was pretty leaky, it seemed like filtration wasn't doing a very good job. But in other homes which are fairly better sealed, and when we're thinking about energy efficiency, what are your thoughts on what is better? Is it filtration, or is it ventilation, or is it somewhere in the middle?
Okay, so this is an answer question I would struggle to give a short answer to, but briefly, filter energy consequences are really complex because we're not talking, a filter doesn't use energy. The system that it's in uses energy, and the performance of that system in terms of things like airflow rate and fan power are a function just as much of the system itself as the filter you put in. So there's not kind of a one-to-one there. But if I were to simplify a lot of research very simply that's been done over the past few decades, in a residential system in general, the energy consequences of filtration are quite small. In some homes, it's actually positive. So if you use a higher performance filter, you're actually going to save fan energy. But it's, of course, much more complex than that. So almost always in any type of extreme climate, filtration is going to be, more energy efficient than ventilation. But filtration just removes particles generally. Maybe a few other things depending on the type of filter, but fundamentally that's not the only reason we ventilate, of course. And so I don't think you can really do a one-to-one comparison like that, but I do suggest that people who are interested in this question look at some of the literature on filtration and energy use, because I think most people come away from that realizing that, oh, I can improve the efficiency of my filters without having huge energy consequences.
All right. Great, thanks. So we have just a couple more minutes left in this discussion, and I wanted to ask Lisa this one question. Did you control for differences in income among the 3 types of housing? Do you control for other sources of exposure in the homes?
That's such a great question. And a short answer to that very long-winded paragraph I'm forming in my head is that with every study, you study and then you learn about it. And man, I can tell you that income range is definitely a limitation to our study. I mean, in Colorado Boulder, when we recruited our participants, most of them living in the same area also were pretty wealthy, I would say, in the same area. Some of them were professors in the university, some of them had their own company. So that's definitely a limitation. And that's why right now we're trying to partner up with a different institution to have a bigger study and controlling parameters. One of the parameters that we controlled for is location. We try to have everyone in the same location, single family homes, approximately the same number of people living in the home, and also square footage of that home. There's a lot that I can go on and on in that list. I want to try to keep this brief, but there are short stories that we did control for certain factors. And the long story is that as we did the study, there were other factors that we realized, man, in a bigger study, we really need to control for this. And I have an ongoing list of that going. So thank you for that question.
Great, thanks. So we have just a couple more minutes, and there are a lot of questions in the chat. There are lots of suggestions in the chat. I recommend people actually, and I believe the speakers will actually be answering some of the questions that were not asked during this Q&A session, and the Google Doc will be shared later on. But in the last couple of minutes, I'd like to give each of the speakers maybe 30 seconds. The one thing that people should take away from your talk today. Dustin, do you want to go first?
You didn't prep us for this one. I would just, but takeaway from my talk is that, using CO2 sensors for ventilation is good, is a good thing that you can do to find problem areas. It's not the definitive step. If you see a high CO2 reading, it doesn't mean you're at risk. It just means you're at more risk than low CO2 sensor. So to summarize, yeah, if you see a high CO2 reading, or if you see a low CO2 reading, you're not necessarily safe, but you're safer than if you see a high CO2 reading.
Great, thanks. Andy?
I guess the biggest message that I would have is, we need to know what we're using and what limitations may be. But at the same time, and I was trying to allude to this, the particles respond to, or the sensors respond to indoor particles. So if all we're worried about is turning on, saying, an air cleaner, they may be okay, because that's sort of a binary response. But if we're thinking about long-term exposures, they may be less reliable than a more standardized method.
Okay, thanks. Lisa?
I think one takeaway is that these low-cost air quality monitors, in the kind of study they were presenting, bearing in mind the word low cost is very powerful. So if you're trying to find a monitor that has all 50 criteria and is super accurate and super reliable, then I think the words low cost doesn't really apply here. A lot of the times as researchers, we're taking these low-cost sensors and we're deploying them like we were if we're going to be consumers and in a commercial setting. And we're trying to test out if they work, and they are reliable to a certain extent. They're not accurate, but if you want them for maybe your kids, like what Dustin was saying, they're super powerful in education. And part of our study was also to have fun with our participants. A lot of them had their sensors walking around with their kids and showing them, what an air pollution sensor looks like and what is PM, and that really helped make the study even more fun.
Great. Jeff?
I'd make two comments. The first one is, the data I showed were part of a much larger project where we use much more sophisticated instruments, and I'm still most excited by this data set from these low-cost monitors. First of all, it tells the same story, and second of all, it really fundamentally answers the question, do filters make a difference in these homes? So I think there's a lot of promise there. The second point is, the other thing that I think I'm really engaged with is, how can we use the output of these sensors and do other things? And this idea of predictive air cleaning, or there's some questions in the chat about ventilation control. I think there's a lot of opportunity there to use things. So the answer might not be, what's the actual particle concentration or CO2 or whatever concentration in the space, but what can we do with the output of these sensors to have better indoor air quality?
Great, thanks. Suresh?
Yeah, I think, these low-cost indoor air quality sensors may or may not have the accuracy you want for research projects, but they have the precision you need to answer some questions about indoor air ventilation. So I think we should not be dismissive about it just because it might have some accuracy questions. I think they're really powerful tools to that you can use to ask questions about ventilation. And I think what we found was that if you use sort of identical sensors, it allows us to now analyze the results. And what we found was that The existing standards are good for CO2 when it comes to biological aerosols. If you're a facility facility manager, what you should be doing is maxing out the air exchange rate if you can, because we are worried about maybe one emitter. So even if there's 2 people in the room, rather than trying to optimize for CO2, we should be optimizing for particles. And that means air changes per hour, more important than the volume of airflow per person that we have traditionally been doing.
Great, thanks, Suresh. And thank all the speakers for this wonderful presentation and this excellent discussion. Now we will play a video from the EPA challenge. Is that right, Sandra? Thanks.
Correct. Here we go.
Hello, I'm Emily Snyder from the U.S. EPA's Office of Research and Development. I am here today to let you know about an exciting new prize-based competition that we call Challenge, launched on February 17th. Wildland fires produce fine particulate matter, PM 2.5, and there are concerns about exposure to this pollutant as well as other pollutants in wildfire smoke. This challenge is looking for design ideas to create cleaner indoor air during wildfires or high pollution episodes, with the hopes that this will encourage the development of new, effective, low-cost approaches to remove PM 2.5. We would also like solutions that can provide cooling and operate during power outages. I would like to pause here to highlight our federal, tribal, state, and local partners who worked with us on this challenge. Current air cleaners are expensive to purchase, operate, and maintain. Affordability is key. Those living in poor communities may not have central HVAC, which provides some filtering of outdoor air. They may also live in structures with a less sealed building envelope, which leads to additional infiltration of wildfire smoke. In addition, current air cleaners cannot effectively cool the air. They can be noisy, so people turn them off, and they are dependent upon electrical power. And this is an issue because there are periods of power outages due to public safety power shutoffs or other causes. These limitations inhibit the widespread use of these air cleaners. This is a true missed opportunity to reduce exposures, particularly in environmental justice communities. Now I would like to give a preview of the challenge criteria, starting with the must-have criteria, PM 2.5 reduction. In a room of 150 square feet with 8 feet ceilings and PM 2.5 concentrations ranging from 35 to 300 microgram per meter cubed, solutions should achieve greater than 80% reduction in 1 hour. And because some smoke episodes can last for extended periods of time, the solution must maintain these reductions over a few weeks, even during high outdoor concentrations. If the solution is novel, the reductions may be more modest or take longer to achieve. However, the solver must describe how the loss in these performance criteria is outweighed by gains in other qualities related to the challenge criteria. Details on other criteria such as cost and noise requirements can be found in the challenge posting. So here is the schedule for the challenge as well as details on the awards. So the challenge was launched on February 17th. We had an informational webinar today on March 4th, and during this webinar, the launch webinar slides as well as more information on the challenge can be found at the link below. The challenge submissions are due May 17th, and the winners will be announced in late summer. We will select up to 5 finalists to receive awards of up to $10,000 each from a total award pool of $50,000. So on the left-hand side, you will see the incentive website, which is where all solutions will be submitted. On the right-hand side of the screen is a screenshot of challenge.gov. Our challenge will also appear on their main page, and you can click on View External Challenge Details, and it will point you to the incentive website. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that introduction of the Cleaner Indoor Air During Wildfires Challenge. I dropped the website into the chat if you want more information, but otherwise we're going to close out today's session. The recording will be available on our website tomorrow and will go out in an email to everybody. Once again, thank you so much to our presenters and to our moderators for running a wonderful session. I hope everybody has a great day.